heard about God's math. Some of us think the wrath of God might be easier than the math of God, but it isn't. All right, so we already talked about multiplication, the multiplication of the oil. When the widow of one of the sons of the prophets her creditors were coming after her, and she was going to have to sell her sons into slavery. Remember that God multiplied the oil as she believed. However many vessels she brought in, not a few, he blessed, and she was able to sell that oil and save her sons. And so that was the multiplication. Today we're going to start with addition. Addition 1. That means there'll be a 2. That's a hint. Addition 1. A small room and a small boy. A small room and a small boy. Let's read this passage now. We did 1 through 7. That whole story of the oil and all was only 7 verses. Now we're going to read 8 to 10. One day, Elisha went on to Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to eat some food. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat food. And she said to her husband, "Behold, now I know that this is a holy man of God, who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls, and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there." Wasn't that thoughtful? So this section I call the prophet's chambers. The prophet's chambers. The reason I use the word chamber instead of room is because this is something that continues to exist in churches with this name. Or they might say room. But they'll say a church, our church in Duluth had a prophet's chambers. Our church in Westminster had a prophet's chambers. What these are rooms the church sets aside or has extra, and they put a bed. They basically put these type of simple furnishings in it, and if a visiting pastor or missionary, even a couple, comes, they don't have to get a hotel, but they can not have to stay in people's homes. Now, you might think, well, aren't there people who are kind enough to take them in? There might be. But if you're staying for a season, say you're home for 3 months, it gets hard to stay with people, doesn't it? Here they have a place that they can treat as theirs while they're there. There was a doctor actually in the Singapore church that supported me when I was a missionary. There was a church in Singapore I got connected with, and there was a doctor in the church, and he had a clinic. And above the clinic was a flat, they call them flats, apartment, that he had lived in when they first started the clinic, but now he had moved on to a house. So instead of renting that flat out, he kept it as a prophet's chambers, as a place when visiting missionaries, like myself, I stayed there many times. Even when Mom and Dad came to visit, one of the times they came, they stayed with me in that flat, free. And it was a really nice little place. And whenever you had to email and schedule, because many missionaries wanted to use it. Singapore's an expensive place to stay. And we would email and line up, yes, it's available, you can have it this day to this day. And when I'd arrived there, and it was right by the public transportation, which is really easy to work with there, and you could just walk half a block and get on the train. And when he knew I was coming, I'd arrive and there would be breakfast food. All milk included, fruits. They were excellent fruit in Singapore. Cereal. He knew we would be out and about all day, but he made sure we had breakfast covered. And it was no charge, never. It was a prophet's place. It was a place where we could be refreshed. Shunem, where this happened, is about halfway between where the sons of the prophets, where Elisha lived, I forget the name of the town, and Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is where Elijah had the showdown with the prophets of Baal. And it was a place that it appears Elisha would go to be refreshed in the Lord, to spend time with the Lord. And halfway between was the city of Shunem. And as he would pass, this wealthy woman started to notice him and wanted to help him. And God provided through her a small, simply furnished room provided for Elisha's use whenever he went to or through Shunem. Made, though not requested, by a wealthy woman. He didn't ask her to make it. She saw the need and did it. And we see a couple things about her. We see she's wealthy. We see she's married. We see she recognizes and knows that Elisha is a holy man of God. Did her husband recognize that? I don't know. We don't know anything about her husband. We don't find he is interacting at all with the prophet. But she does. She recognizes he's a holy man of God. She noticed the passing by, and she thought he would be blessed to have a place of his own. I don't know if it had a roof. She said, you see that? Let us make him a small room on the roof with walls. Okay. You know, the windows spots in Indonesia and Singapore, and many of the houses don't have windows in them. It's never cold. It's never so cold that you need the windows. It's a little tough for air conditioning. We had one room of our house that we boarded up all the windows because there were no windows there. You know, if there were windows, they didn't close all the way because they never needed them closed. We boarded up the windows on that house so that we could have air conditioning in one room because it's very hot and humid there. But they don't have windows. And Israel, you know, open to the sky, I guess. And all it had in it were what he needed, basics, a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. It reminds me of the first time Pastor Dave, when he was like 5 years old, he came home and said he wanted to tell us a joke. You know, we're all older, as you hear often. He said, I want to tell a joke. Okay, what's your joke? He says, what is it that you sit on, sleep on, and brush your teeth with? We're like, wow, that's pretty good. That's a stumper. Until he said the answer. A chair, a bed, and a toothbrush.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So see, now his jokes are much better. Let's be like this woman. When we see a need, God expects us to do what we can to meet it. We are blessed to bless. We are blessed to bless. Now, I could have said we are blessed to be a blessing, but it wouldn't fit. That is totally the reason for the wording. When we see a need, God expects us to do what we can to meet it. We are blessed to bless. We have a saying here on one of the t-shirts of the church, right? So loved to show love. This kind of goes with that. Listen to this verse. If I say, well, if you're saying, well, you know, we don't have to. I mean, maybe we see a need, but we're supposed to point it out to other people to meet. Listen to what 1 John 3:17 says. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? It's pretty straightforward. Anyone who sees his brother in need, and then it says, has goods. That means you have the way to meet that need. We're supposed to do it. We're supposed to be more aware and not so much just asking prayer for them. That's even one of the things Jesus said, or one of them, was it Jesus who said, if you see a need and you just say, pray, we'll pray for you, we'll pray for you. That isn't what I want you to do. You can pray for him, but I also want you to meet the need, if you can. Not close your heart. And that's what the Shunammite woman did. She opened her heart, did what she could to help. So let's go on to the next several verses. One day, Elisha, came there, and he turned into the chamber and rested there. And he said to Gehazi, his servant, call this Shunammite. When he had called her, she stood before him, and he said to him, "Say now to her, 'See, you have taken all this trouble for us. What is to be done for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army?' She answered, 'I dwell among my own people.' And he said, 'What then is to be done for her?' Gehazi answered, 'Well, she has no son, and her husband is old.' He said, 'Call her.' And when he had called her, she stood in the doorway. And he said, 'At this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son.' And she said, 'No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant.' But the woman conceived, and she bore a son about that time the following spring, as Elisha had said to her." Now there's a couple of things in here we don't quite understand. Had Gehazi call the woman, and then he said to Gehazi, "Ask her if she needs anything." Sounds like she's standing right there. Now, we may think that this is treating her lower than himself, but it might be her position that he's honoring by having his go-between, because she's a wealthy woman. And it may be that's what he's doing. It's something cultural that makes him tell his servant what to tell her while she's standing there. It's like they're not talking to each other, right? Tell her to do this. Yeah. But then he says, after she's gone, apparently, Gehazi has an idea and says, she doesn't have a son. She's got an old husband. She's going to be left pretty soon, and she won't have anyone to take care of her. Because that's what they did in that day. That's who took care of you. Elisha says, good idea. Now remember, he had offered to talk to the king or the army commander on her behalf. And she said, "I dwell among my own people. I'm happy. I'm at home. Everything's fine. My people are here. My family's here. We take care of each other. I don't need extra help." But they thought of this, and so she came up. And it's kind of a sad thing, we'll revisit this later, that she says, "Don't lie to me." Perhaps she's had others tell her, "Oh, you're going to get pregnant. Oh, you're going to have," and it may gave her hope, false hope. False hope. Elijah wants to repay her. The prophet's gift. The prophet's gift. We hear her gift was the prophet's chamber. Now we're going to see what his gift is going to be. And we know what it's going to be. It's going to be a son. Elisha wants to repay her. She says she's fine. Gehazi suggests she might want a son. Perhaps she can't because of the older husband. Likely she will be left a widow with no son. The woman doesn't want to be given false hope, but God gives her the promised son. False hope is a very painful thing, isn't it? To be told everything's fine and everything isn't. To be told something good is going to happen and it doesn't. And what we can do is we can become afraid and not want to hope and tell people, "Don't tell me that. I don't want to know that because it's going to hurt when it doesn't happen." But I want us to be reminded of God's promises. Hope based on the promise of the Lord. Hope based on the promise of the Lord is never false. Because he who promised is faithful. He who promised is faithful. Hebrews 10:23. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. It's not our hope that's faithful. Sometimes you talk to the world, watch movies, you can say it was their hope that accomplished this. They kept on hoping when it made no sense to hope, and their hope was repaid. Hope has no power. It's who our hope is in. And when our hope is in the Lord, he is faithful. If our hope is in the promises of God, we will not have false hope. As long as we know it's God's promise. Because he who made that promise is faithful. He keeps his promises. so we can have hope without worrying whether or not it's false. Because he who promised is faithful. All right, so we go on to the next section. So the addition to the addition was a small room and a small boy that God provided, one for the prophet, one for the prophet's provider, for the Shunammite woman. So some of you have read these stories before, and so when I say the next section is called subtraction, the Shunammite's loss. The Shunammite's loss. Now, I am not choosing to call her the Shunammite as if that's just the way I want to make sure you know who it is. She's constantly referred to as the Shunammite or the Shunammite woman. That's her title. So I used it. So we're going to go on in this story. When the child had grown, so could this ongoing relationship of Elisha visiting there continues till the child has grown. We don't know how old, not very old, not very small. So you'll see by the story that he has to be old enough to do some things and small enough to do others. So you'll see his age area there. When the child had grown, he went one day to his father among the reapers. There's a little age involved. You don't send a 1-year-old. And he said to his father, okay, he speaks, "Oh, my head, my head." The father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother." Maybe he had heat stroke or something, it seemed. Something out there happened. And when he had lifted him and brought him to his mother, able to be lifted, okay, see there you're getting some of the age there. The child sat on her lap till noon, and then he died. Wow. Tragic. Just went out well that morning. She held him for whatever time, till noon, and then he died. I highlighted that because don't let anyone try to tell you this child was just unconscious. It clearly says he died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. So the first thing she does when the child dies, that's your next line, the child dies. And then she just goes straight up to the prophets. She doesn't go tell her husband in the field. She doesn't seem to tell anyone. She just goes up to where Elisha's room is. He isn't there. Lays the child on Elisha's bed, dead. Then she called her husband and said, "Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again." This is a half day's journey, normally, okay? She wants a donkey and a servant to take her to where he is, so he isn't visiting right then. And he, the husband, said, "Why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath." Now, there may be something they do on those days that they go to want to see the prophet about on new moons, to present offerings or to talk or something, or to bring something to him. Never know. She said, "All is well." She's going to say that quite a few times. I think what we're seeing here is that she has a faith. All is well. Then she saddled the donkey and she said to her servant, "Urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Look, there is the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, 'Is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child?' And she answered, 'All is well.'" Okay, so the mother takes a fast donkey to see Elisha. First off, the child is already dead. What's the rush? There's a couple things. As I was reading this, I hadn't even thought about that. The fact is, the child's dead. Does she already believe he can be raised from the dead? Is the rush also involved? Because Elisha's going to show rush too when he hears what's happened, or when God tells him. He's going to be in a rush too. She didn't tell her husband. What if he comes up there, finds the dead child and buries him? Then, of course, God couldn't raise him. Ha! Yes, he could. That wouldn't really change the story. It's called Lazarus. Check it out. But we're going to look more into this as we go. Elijah's questions to her are some we can ask ourselves this way. Maybe we should be doing this more. Is all spiritually well? Is all well? Is all spiritually well? Is everything well with my soul? Is it well with my soul? Is all spiritually well with you or with me, however you want to put that? I think we need to do self-examinations. I think we need to not just assume I know how to go to church regularly, I know how to read my Bible, I know I do this, check box, check box, check box. But where are we really at spiritually? Are we well? Is all well? Now she said, all is well. Now I don't know if she just didn't want to wait. She didn't want to say anything until she could tell it all. And if she said something right off, she wouldn't get to really, it was a servant. She wants the real thing. She wants Elisha, perhaps. But I think we can also ask you who have husbands, is all well with your husband? Is all well with your husband? Betty, our husbands are fine. But there can be very important, significant people in our lives that we're close to. And it could be your husband for you also, spouse, it could be. But are there people in our lives that we have close enough contact with that we have a little bit of spiritual responsibility to encourage them? Perhaps to rebuke in a gentle way initially, but definitely to pray for them. If we just check boxes, if we just go through life, or is your husband in a spiritual state that he needs the Lord and you should be constantly praying for him? You should be praying for God to bring people besides you and people, into his life so he can meet him. And other people who are significant to you. Put that if you want. It doesn't have to be a husband. There are people that, because of our relationship, we have a spiritual responsibility to be more concerned. And you said, well, yeah, my kids. Well, that's the next one. Your child. Is all well with your child? Those are the three things he asked. Is all well with you? And don't feel bad if you check out yourself first, because you can't really do what you need to do in the lives of the others if your own spiritual life is not where it needs to be. We need to be spiritually healthy before we can serve others. I taught a class at the Bible college. Actually, Dan was teaching a class to pastors, a pastoral training class. And he asked me to speak at one of them. And what I spoke on is pastoring yourself. And before the pastors, before those who work, teach, minister, work with youth, whatever our ministry area is, before we can be the most effective in making sure where their spiritual health is if ours is in the right place. And it really has to be ourselves we look at first. That's where our fullest and most spiritual responsibility is. Look what 2 Corinthians 13:5 says. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Or do you not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test? Are we nurturing that relationship we have with Jesus Christ in us? Are we keeping it healthy? Are we feeding ourselves spiritually? Are we doing the things so that we are spiritually healthy enough to answer the question about our husband or about our loved one, about others we're spiritually responsible for? Are they well? First, we must be. Then we can see, are they? Not for the sake of pointing it out to them. You know, you're spiritually really missing right now. Actually, one of the best things that can work for people to remind them is their kids. You ever notice that? Your son, Ryu. Virginia's son, I've heard of times he's talked to somebody that he loves, that is a Christian, and he says, if you're a Christian, why don't you go to church? And it kind of wakes people up sometimes. And again, that message last night would be, you know, why wouldn't you want to be with God's people? Why would you not do what's best for your spiritual health? I thought one of the funny and interesting and poignant, if you ever use that word, things he said was that if people say, do we have to go to church, or does it have to do Sabbath? And he said, no, but it's really the best wisdom. There's no law that you have to brush your teeth or take shower in this country. You will not go to prison. No one will try to arrest or fine you. But it really is the best wisdom. And it is far better for us than brushing our teeth or showering. By the way, and I'll close with this, I have another page, but I have 5 minutes, and we all know I'll barely finish. What was I going to say? Oh, I had someone come and ask about how much should we force our children to read the Bible and have a devotional time. And at first I thought, yeah, that's a little hard. Then I went, wait a minute. Do you force them to brush their teeth? Yes. Why? Because that's best for their teeth. What about their soul? What about their relationship with God? Do you force them? And it's funny how we will take this off that same idea. And yet it's the most important thing we have to do is to raise godly children. You don't have any other more important job, if you're a mother, than to raise godly children. Number one, job one. The next thing I knew, I came to this friend's house and she had on the fridge a chore chart. Their morning chores. They had to check them off. And it was brush your teeth, make your bed, put your clothes in the laundry, or get dressed, and then it had read the Bible and pray. And you know, I went, why not? It may seem like a chore when it starts, but don't you think now you would never want to skip brushing your teeth? You don't have to put it on a chore chart. Please. I mean, am I the only one who doesn't think, should I brush my teeth today? You know, no one will know if I don't. Oh, yes, they will. I think sometimes we get so afraid or worried about pushing God on our children, we neglect to teach them and to show them this is more important than brushing your teeth. This is how important this is. And it is. We admit it is. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to say, this is what we do. Because we are going to be followers of Jesus. Yes?
I started doing that for the pandemic. My kids can't read yet, so we'll do a story every day. Now every night before we go to bed, when I forget, they ask for it.
Hey, praise God.
They listen to it every night, they listen to stories every night.
And when they start reading, I hope all of you will not be afraid to say, just at least read one verse. Maybe you'll have to do it with them. And it takes discipline on your part, doesn't it? That's the challenge. But it's worth it. You may see it in this life and it'll be worth it. But it's also what the Bible says. Raise up. Where were we? Malachi. In Malachi, in case you wonder, where does that verse that Gabe always says it's parents, the purpose of being parents and married and having children is to raise godly offspring. It's in Malachi. There's only 4 chapters and there's lots of good stuff in there. And that's where it is. He says, he's putting down husbands who are divorcing their wives and saying, God gave you that wife. You are supposed to stay together and be committed to her for the purpose of raising godly offspring. It's right there. And so if that purpose is your purpose before God, you've got to sometimes say, we read our Bible. It's important. I'm going to put it on. You get a star if you do it. For now, whatever helps them develop the habit of doing it. We also tithed in our household off of our little 25-cent offering. And you can't give 2.5 cents, so we had to give 3. But that way we could give a penny to missions. Yes.
I was going to say that as they get older, if you have them, their turn to come out and share. One time our son Tim came out, he put on this robe, it was like I made him for, like Joseph's, anyways, it was many colors. He came out in his robe and he says, "Thus saith Moses." And then he gave his devotional to us. And they like to take the challenge, especially when they learn something at camp, when they learn something. And, but our kids, they had to share what they were reading as they got older, because you can't sit with them then. They should be doing it alone by then. But anyways.
Yeah, and that's part of how your young people grow on Holy Sweat is there's a couple things. The one you probably really would like as parents is they're responsible for something. They're responsible at least once during the time when we were up at kids camp and they were working. One different one comes out every day wearing the same backpack. Whoever's wearing the backpack is in charge that day. They have to make sure everyone gets where they're supposed to get and that they have all the stuff they need. That young person is in charge, whoever has the backpack. They had to come to us and say, what do you need us to do during this chapel? They were responsible, so that's good. But they also all share devotionals. And they learn how to restate what they've studied in the Bible. Those of us who've been through teacher training, we know the highest form of learning is restating. If they can restate something in their own words, they've learned it. I mean, if it's right, the way they restate it. So let's pray, let's ask that question, these questions. Am I well spiritually? Is my husband, are those closest to me well? Are my children well? If the answer is no, what do I need to do to help with that? Next week we're going to start with, we're going to finish subtraction and just go into addition 2 and see what happens. Lord, thank you. Thank you that even math truths can remind us of these stories. I thank you for the reminders to be a blessing when we have opportunity. Thank you for the reminders that hope in you is never false. And thank you for the reminders that we need to be spiritually well. Help us to do what it takes for ourselves and those we love and those we teach to be spiritually well. Be with us now as we go. In Jesus' name, amen.